Well, hello, podcast listeners, and welcome back to the Deonandan podcast. This is Dr. Raywat Deonandan, Global Health Epidemiologist. In today's episode, I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing a young Mr. Patrick Saunders Hastings, who is an up-and-coming bright light in the world of public health research. He has a particular interest in vaccinations against infectious diseases. And in our conversation today, we talked about the new bill in California, which makes vaccination mandatory to attend public schools. As always, if you want to check out Patrick's biography or links to any of the stories that we talked about in this episode, go to the website, deonandan.com, click on podcast, and scroll down to the relevant episode. As well, the first 4 minutes of this episode, there is a droning noise in the background. That's my air conditioner being problematic. But it goes away after 4 minutes. So just put up with that for a couple minutes and everything else will be smooth sailing. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy my interview with Patrick Saunders Hastings. Okay, well, welcome back, podcast listeners, to the Deonandan podcast. I'm Dr. Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist and faculty member at the University of Ottawa. And I have the distinct pleasure of today sitting down with Mr. Patrick Saunders Hastings, who is a PhD student in our program in population health studies. And I've had the great pleasure of having had Patrick as an assistant in one of my classes, and I sat on his defense committee. He did a great job, and we've gotten to know each other quite well. And he's a fascinating fellow who has great insights into a lot of issues surrounding infectious disease and policy. And do you want to say something about your consulting work?
Maybe I'll jump in before you hype me up too much. Afraid I won't be able to live up to the reputation. I do some work in pandemic flu with the university, and then I split some time working in a sort of risk consulting firm downtown, and that's very sort of policy oriented as well. There's some work looking at both climate change and microbial risk, mostly in Canada and the United States, so that helps keep me busy as well.
That's a lot of work for a graduate student. Most of my students struggle just getting the theses done, but you're doing all this kind of stuff.
I get bored easy.
Gotcha. ADT, gotcha. We have drugs for that now. So I invited Patrick over to talk about a number of public health issues. One in particular is close to both of our hearts. Not that we both have two hearts, but between us we've got two hearts, and it's cool. So, boy, that's a bad joke. We'll have to edit that out later.
Edit in the last, you'll be fine.
Good point. Need a laugh track. So recently in California, a certain bill was passed into law. Let me get the actual bill number here, because my brain is going. Bill SB 277, and this is the bill that compels parents to vaccinate their children, otherwise they're not permitted to go to public school. And it was signed into law just a few days ago by the governor of California, Jerry Brown, and it's created quite a lot of controversy. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, do you have any opening comments about the bill?
Well, there's nothing like a crisis at Disneyland to get the policy moving, right?
And you say that because this all started because of the measles outbreak?
Early this year, I think it was either late December 2014 or January 2015, there was at least 117 cases that were traced of measles that were traced back to a Disneyland outbreak. And this was all sort of attributed to declining measles, mumps, rubella vaccination rates in California. And this spread through the U.S., through Mexico, and we think into Canada.
Canada?
Well, this year there was over 160 cases of measles in Quebec alone.
And this is a spike, obviously, in the past.
This is much higher.
Right. We should say the obvious. We suspect this is because of the anti-vaccination movement.
Certainly.
And the anti-vaccination movement, the foundations of their argument that vaccinations are inherently dangerous and possibly causally associated with a variety of bad outcomes, among them, I'm afraid to say it, autism. Right?
It's getting there early.
Well, we got to get this out of the way, because most
Sure.
of the listeners will have understood that there's this ongoing controversy that people believe there's an association between some everyday vaccines and autism, and we know that is not the case.
So yes, you can attribute falling vaccine rates in Ontario even, and increases in personal exemptions to that infamous Lancet paper, which I think was in 2010, claiming a link between vaccines and autism. Later came out that the authors were fudging their data. It was retracted, but the damage was already done.
Right. So the criticisms of the law are interesting. So I think public health people are, in general, in favor of some sort of legislative procedure to increase the vaccination rates. And the concern, of course, is that more students are entering the public school system who aren't vaccinated are putting those who are perhaps not of that particular mindset at risk. Now, let me ask you a question. The students who are vaccinated, why aren't they fine? Why isn't it fine to some say, just, hey, I'll vaccinate my kids and you do what with your kids because, you can't affect my kids because they're vaccinated?
Well, the problem with measles is that it's so infective that you need about a 95% herd immunity rate. And in California last year, about 1/4 of schools were not meeting that threshold.
Do you want to define herd immunity for
Sure.
listeners?
Herd immunity is the idea that those who are vaccinated protect those who are not vaccinated. So it sort of speaks to what you're saying, that if I'm vaccinated from measles, I'm protected, and I'm protecting you in a very indirect way because I can't give you measles. So those parents who have vaccinated their kids have less to worry about, but there's a whole other set of issues, one being that lots of kids can't get vaccinated, such as those that are immunocompromised, kids with leukemia, things like that, they can't get vaccinated. Further, you hate to even say it anymore, but all medical interventions have some degree of risk, no matter how minimal. So there's this idea of distributive justice, that those who are not vaccinating their kids might be benefiting from herd immunity without putting their kids through that risk, however minimal.
That sounds like communism, sir. Well, okay, so all medical procedures have some degree of risk. Then is it not the individual's choice whether or not to acquiesce to that risk?
I don't think so. I don't think in public health. And I think one of the things that might have maybe held back this discussion a little bit is this real focus on autonomy in a person. And it's that old biomedical principle. But it comes into play less in public health, where the focus is, by its very nature, on the collective.
Can you think of any other examples we can bring into play as an analogy?
To putting the collective above the individual?
Yeah.
Well, one that's, most of mine are infectious disease emergencies, but another one that might come to mind would be climate change, where you're sacrificing some of your own personal convenience for the good of the community.
Right. How about seatbelts? Seatbelts are mandatory, but it should not be my choice whether or not I want to protect my life in the car.
Well, does you wearing a seatbelt put me at risk?
Possibly. So that's what it comes down to, right? It's the old John Stuart Mill's adage that my rights end where your nose begins.
That's funny. Actually, I was looking at a John Stuart Mill's quote the other day, and it was something like, the government can only exercise power over an individual against his will when it's to protect another from harm.
So the same thing,
yeah.
Except said it more eloquently.
He would have had every anti-vaxxer thrown in jail.
But look at Jim Carrey. So Jim Carrey, the actor, who's very much among those who believes that vaccinations are associated with a series of bad outcomes, among them autism. He has said he's not anti-vaccinations, he's anti-mercury and anti-thimerosal. And he says, yes, I know that most vaccines don't contain these adjuvants anymore, but some still do. And why they still do, he will not be in favor of mandatorily, if that's a word, exposing children to such pollutants.
Yeah, but every vaccine being mandated and required in schools has been proven again and again to not carry any risk of mercury poisoning. They're very safe vaccines. The measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is one of the most efficient, safe vaccines we have.
So the mercury thing is a canard? It's not something we should care about?
I think it's burying the lead a little bit.
Right. I've read that there's more mercury in a serving of seafood than there is.
I was about to say we're gonna outlaw salmon and tuna.
Well, they're so cute. They're hideous.
Discussion for another day.
All right. So I'm really interested in the arguments against the bill, and you're right; they do tend to be associated with the idea of autonomy. Is that yes, we can provide options for people. You should not do this. You should not smoke. You should not drink and drive. You should not eat too many carbs and get fat. And you should get vaccinated. But ultimately, that's a personal choice. How do you feel about the people who associate or draw parallels to this law with, well, they've done it already. They've made allusions to Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
I have to bring it up because it's
we live in a world where we like to go for the top shelf criticism right away. And it's a criticism we've heard when people are putting in smoking regulation and anytime government comes in and tries to affect individual behavior. Because, Hitler was anti-smoking. So.
And anti-vaccination.
But again, it's part of the problem with that movement is they say things like this, which can be very hard to argue reasonably with because they're such sensationalist statements. And no one is going to hold down children and stick needles in their arm unless they have panic attacks. You can still opt out, but you have to choose to get your kid homeschooled. So you have that choice, but if you're looking to benefit from other social programs, I think it's fair to require you to do your part.
How would you feel about a proposal to say that, and this is not me saying this, others have proposed this, that if you're going to deny my child an education because of my individual choices around his health, then I should be able to opt out of the taxation that supports public education?
Well, it's hard to say what you can pick and choose opting out of, isn't it?
So a la carte choices in taxation.
And I mean, my initial response to your previous point is that it's not the government choosing to exclude them from the education, it's the parent.
Right. Interesting.
And it's one of the things that's always sort of bugged me about the anti-vaccination campaign is that it's a choice made by the parent, but a burden carried by the kid.
That's well phrased. So someone else, and I've spent an interesting afternoon looking through troubling tweets from people who are troubled by this bill. And I say troubling tweets because a lot of them are nonsensical and a lot of them are anti-scientific, but some of them do tug at what passes for heartstrings in my heartless consciousness. And one person has said that this is a slippery slope, so to go. That once the government starts mandating medical treatment, then what's to stop them from mandating, let's say, psychiatric treatment? That you need to be drugged. You need to be on Adderall. Your creativity is problematic. You need to be suppressed. Your sexual outwardness is problematic. You need to be chemically castrated. Whatever it might be.
I think one of the things that makes infectious disease so exceptional, perhaps especially in the States, is the link it has to security. And this is something that's been built up over the years, and it goes back to that Disneyland outbreak. It's very, very dramatic. And as soon as a security threat becomes clear to the American people especially, but to humans more generally, they're much quicker to act. And so I think it's a bit of a categorical difference between that and, for example, psychiatric care or something like that. I think this is it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and that's one of the criticisms I've seen for this movement.
So this is more of a legal question, I guess, but I mean, not your expertise. Sure. But does this not present some sort of precedent for mandating medication?
Well, the precedent was already there. 2 states have already eliminated these exemptions.
Good point.
Do you know, trivia question, do you know which 2? Because they surprised me.
West Virginia, Mississippi?
Yeah. I mean, take my right to exemption, but leave me my guns.
The DND podcast in no way associates with a sort of anti-West Virginia, anti-Mississippi sentiments. Now, I was cheating there because I had the answer right in front of me in my computer. I actually did not know that. But it is interesting. So that's a whole different other topic there around making ecological assumptions about entire states' belief systems based upon stereotypes put forth by their artistic content. No country music songs. Don't vaccinate my child.
If I could go off on a tangent, though, because what this bill sort of got me into was how Canada's actually lagging a bit behind the States on this.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more.
Well, only 3 provinces in Canada have school vaccination requirements. And I didn't know that because Ontario is one of them. So I just grew up with my vaccine requirements, and they actually have some of the most stringent. The other 2, I think it was Manitoba and PEI. I might have botched that, but I think Manitoba and PEI are the only other two. Manitoba and New Brunswick, that's what it is, are the only other 2 that have legislation. And Alberta, for example, or BC, they don't even sort of ask your vaccination record when you enter school. So parents have no idea what risk their kid has when they go to that school.
Okay, I've got a question now. What's the point of having differential regulations and procedures in various provinces when diseases know no borders, boundaries, whatever?
Well, I mean, is that just making an argument against the provincial healthcare system?
A little bit. Well, also, I mean, what is the let's go legislation on the way here. What's the role of the Public Health Agency of Canada then, if not to help to smooth over these differences?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly think there is a role for them there, and it's less legislative. I think something that's been quite an embarrassment in the vaccine campaign is that we're getting our asses kicked by the anti-vaxxers. And maybe it's because we don't have people as charismatic as Jim Carrey or Jenny McCarthy. But I think...
Well, speak for yourself.
I think it's, at least in part, there needs to be a greater education component to improve acceptance of vaccines as opposed to just legislation. And part of that is because I see those who don't get their kids vaccinated in two groups. The first being what we would call anti-vaxxers, the really strongly opposed that get the personal exemptions. The other group are what you might call vaccine hesitant, who are sort of flip-flopping on the fence. They might have delayed vaccines and then just sort of never got around to it. And that's the group that legislation is most likely to hit and influence. But I think a push from the other side, which is where researchers like you and I come in, is pushing for a broader acceptance of vaccines.
Interesting. Now, where is the role of research in all of this?
You know, it's hard to say because as far as I'm concerned, the research is already there. You know, we know that these vaccines are effective. I think in terms of the health component, it's so much more about risk communication. For example, a kid who doesn't get vaccinated for measles is 35 times more likely to contract measles than a vaccinated kid. I think that where the real research component can come in is on the economic side of things. And we see it with debate nowadays on whether the government and the provincial governments should fund HPV vaccinations for boys. The morality is sound, no one's arguing that. The health benefits are clear, but it's asking if it makes dollars and cents.
Is the morality clear? You want to summarize for the naive listener why there is such a resistance to HPV vaccination for girls?
Sure, yes. Often around Catholic school boards.
He said that, I didn't say that. Please don't sue me.
And I'm sorry to take you further down the rabbit hole. The HPV vaccination is to treat human papillomavirus. It's sexually transmitted disease, the most common STD or STI in Canada. And it's most effective and really only effective if it's administered before the individual is sexually active. So that means that right now, girls and those boys who receive it tend to get it sometime between, I think, ages 9 and 13. This has caused a huge backlash in the religious community, but elsewhere as well, who suggest that administering this vaccine for free is a sort of tacit endorsement of the fact that these girls are going to become sexually active. I think last year, this researcher did a broad-scale project in Ontario involving 250,000 girls to show that receiving the vaccine did not cause them to be more sexually promiscuous. And she was actually sort of crucified, for lack of a better term for this.
Interesting religious term.
Because everyone was saying, well, duh, I mean, what a waste of research money. But there's people out there who believe that, so you need to have a response to that.
Right, but you say there's no moral controversy when it comes to vaccinating boys.
Well, I don't think there's a moral controversy when it comes to vaccinating girls. Right? So I think there's no moral controversy when it comes to the HPV vaccination. That's my discussion. I think what has come out is how best to address HPV. And there's a lot of people who say that, well, it's enough that boys benefit from the herd immunity accrued from girls being vaccinated. And I understand that argument. If every girl's being vaccinated, then a lot of boys are going to be protected. Homosexual boys won't be. And, you know, if you go international, you can contract it and bring it back. I mean, there's all sorts of gaps still.
Yeah. That logic sounds like saying boys are protected from pregnancy by the immunity offered by the contraceptive pill taken by girls.
Yeah. Okay, fine, but I'd still like to protect myself, right?
Right. And we both know there's still pregnancy going on. Interesting. I find the HPV vaccine infuriating. I mean, from this perspective, how many years have we heard cries from the public that scientists need to develop an anti-cancer vaccine? Now we finally have one, and they don't want to take it.
Yeah, it's one of the most striking things to me as well. I mean, we know that I think two strains of HPV cause 70% of cervical cancers, and still people are saying no.
Right.
And it sort of goes back to what you were talking about, government money and the responsibilities that carries, because a lot of Catholic schools accept government money. But then if they refuse to vaccinate their students, and those students end up being a burden on the government healthcare system, maybe they're reneging on some of their responsibilities that should come with that money.
Let me put you on the hot seat for a second. Would you have the same response if we developed a vaccine against autism?
A vaccine against autism that should be legally mandated?
Yeah. But,
a lot of the analogies that you seem to be trying to draw are not infectious diseases, right? And you're trying to equate the government burden of a person with autism? No. I don't think so.
Okay, it's a difficult question. I don't expect an actual answer from you. So fair.
I don't think the morality lines up the same way.
And as a caveat to that, people should be aware that there is one perspective that, in fact, there's nothing wrong with being autistic. It's just a neuroatypical condition. It's a different kind of human culture. Mm-hmm. Part of the argument goes. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that argument. That's the argument. So, at what point does public health strive to homogenize populations? Is there something individualistic and expressive about being a disease positive? Probably not infectious disease.
I don't think it's fair to equate trying to make a vaccine freely available, because this isn't even forcing, but freely available to those who would want it, to eugenics, right?
Yeah, it's a tortured argument, and I'm trying to make it because I'm trying to create controversy. But yeah, I totally see the logic.
But no one's trying to stigmatize HPV positives, but there was, one of the biggest proponents for vaccination of HPV in boys is a Western MP who just recently retired in Alberta, which is one of the three, I think, that actually provides HPV vaccination to boys, one of the Western provinces. And he is actually, he had stage 5 cancer of the mouth from HPV. So I don't think that there's a lot of men or women out there who are rallying against the public availability of HPV vaccinations.
Okay. And yet we still hear the occasional media voice piping up about the controversies surrounding it.
We live in an age where there's going to be an opinion for every side of every argument, right? There's a few weeks or months ago, I was on the internet and I literally just tried this exercise of typing in a statement I believed and saw evidence of that, and then type in the exact opposite statement and saw evidence of that.
That's fair and balanced, my friend.
Yep.
That's Fox News.
And it was smoking is good for you, smoking is bad for you. Right. Being overweight is good for you, being overweight is bad for you. And the evidence is on both sides for everything.
Yeah, and that's the problem with having the layperson doing back-of-the-envelope scientific investigations using the internet, is you can find evidence for any obscure, ridiculous theory.
If you're not going to take the time to evaluate the evidence that you're being presented with, then you could support any argument.
And I know someone's going to ask, but we haven't got that training, Ray. How can we do that? That's when you hire an epidemiologist. Just contact Patrick or me and say
or a consultant. Yeah, exactly. Now I see how this works. Okay.
This podcast has a purpose, my friend. It's not just about educating the public and feeding my ego. So let's go back to vaccination.
Please, yeah.
Because this is not my field of expertise, but I have dabbled in it slightly, and it's becoming your field of expertise. Where are the challenges broadly in the next 10, 15, 20 years, both domestically and globally, when it comes to the science and the culture of vaccination?
So, there's a few different pillars to that argument, right? When we start in the lab, there's, so many different ones. One that's a bit close to my heart is improving vaccines for neglected tropical disease. It's a bit hard to encourage big pharma or any pharmaceutical company to invest in these diseases with very small infected populations. But it's those being hit worst off that are suffering from this.
But what's the solution then? A government incentive?
Government subsidies would be a big one.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a tough road, certainly, but I think public awareness hopefully leads to political pressure, which hopefully leads to subsidization. And it's a hard and frustrating situation, but private companies will rarely pursue these things on their own.
Right.
And maybe that's not fair to public companies. But another very interesting one, at least politically, is virus sharing between developing and developed countries. And we went through this a few years ago with Indonesia, where they're submitting vaccine samples to developed countries which are producing vaccines and aren't necessarily sharing those vaccines back to the developing countries.
I was not aware this was happening.
Oh, yeah. For a while, and actually I'm not up to date on proceedings anymore, but they were withholding Indonesian virus samples. And as a ethicist like yourself, I guess, would have a lot of thoughts on it, because if a virus outbreak is likely to start in one of these regions, do they have the responsibility to share that virus even if they're not going to reap equitable benefits from it?
Interesting.
So there's a lot of there's two different opinions on it anyway. But a lot of arguments around it.
All right, so what else? We got those two things.
We got those two things. I think there's still a long road to go with encouraging vaccine acceptance globally.
Globally? I thought this was strictly a Western phenomenon.
Take polio, for example, right? And Gates has been banging his head against Nigeria and Pakistan for years.
But the barrier there isn't distrust of the science, the distrust of the caregivers and the public health workers and their mandate. And
sure. I was grouping those a bit together, I guess. But it's hard to trust the science if you don't trust the scientist.
True. That's also profound. We should put this on T-shirts.
Not sure I'd wear that if I would consider myself a scientist.
Okay, so I'd actually never heard of the vaccination crisis being a global phenomenon before.
Sure.
It's so well painted in the West as a California soccer mom thing, not to be sexist or Californiist. Yeah.
No, you're right. And in terms of North America, the vaccination problem tends to lie a bit paradoxically with affluent, well-educated communities. Those are the ones who are refusing.
I have my theories for why that is. Do you have a theory for why that is?
Those tend to be the people who have time to look into this a little bit and are exposed to these ideas, but maybe not the expertise to validate those opinions.
I would tend to agree with that assessment, but also these are individuals who probably don't have a lot of personal experience with infectious disease and such.
Sure.
Whereas those of the lower classes probably have seen some of it already. Right?
That's possible. Yeah.
And you tend not to take for granted free medical care when you've had to struggle to get it.
I think that's certainly a component. The way I've sort of conceptualized it is that fear is a much bigger deterrent, right? And so it might be in the way that fear is distributed, where the affluent fear what they know, which might be autism or something like that.
Speaking of fear, what's the best way to approach the anti-vaccination movement? Is it through convincing people of the validity of the science? Is it through addressing their fears, or is it through incentivizing behavior?
So I saw a very depressing report about a month ago or 2 months ago, which said that those that are already anti-vaxxers can't be saved, that they won't have their minds changed, but hopefully we can save the vaccine hesitant. I think that's a pretty bleak view, and I think that there are a lot of people who are anti-vaccination that can be reasoned with.
Right. I think that's an accurate assessment. I have a saying: I don't try to argue with animals, children, crazy people, and Mac users. I can't argue with them.
Sure.
Evidence is irrelevant.
We should correlate Mac users to anti-vaxxers.
We should correlate Mac users to my audience. See the numbers.
Might be dropping.
I'm sorry, people are kidding. It's a joke. It's like a joke, but that's funny. All right, so, as an educator, I've always felt that we aren't servicing the community sufficiently with respect to proper scientific literacy. And I always thought that was the foundation for much of the anti-vaccination movement, the creationist movement, the anti-science movement in general. As I get older, I'm less inclined to think that way. I think there's more of a, it isn't a misunderstanding of the nature of the science, it's something a bit more individualistic and existential. Almost like, how dare this other class of individual define who I am and what I think, regardless if they make sense or not.
It's possible. I mean, I think that is often a gut reaction to certain mandated regulations. As soon as you try to sort of legislate someone putting something in their body, there is a reaction to that. I've never really thought of that as the main driving force. I think a lot of it has to do with not understanding the chemistry of vaccines. And of course, the really unfortunate link that, the age of autism onset is around 1 year, and measles, mumps, rubella tends to be administered around 14 to 20 months, right. Or vice versa, rather. And just that unfortunate peak between...
Coincidence is half the story.
Yeah, and...
Interesting.
That fear spreads faster than any disease.
Well, amazingly, we're out of time.
Great.
But it's been wonderful talking to you, and I think we're going to talk about some other things in future episodes. And once again, this is Patrick Saunders Hastings I've been speaking to. And is there a way that someone can learn more about you or get in touch with you?
Well, I'd tell you to give them my contact information, but I'm afraid someone from Mississippi might come find me.
There's that.
But I'm available on LinkedIn, Patrick Saunders Hastings, and I'm also on the University of Ottawa website, I believe.
Fantastic. And any listener who wants to learn more about him or about me, just go to the website, deonandan.com, deonandan.com, click on podcast, and scroll down to this episode, which doesn't yet have a title. It will probably have something about vaccination or Patrick Saunders Hastings in the title, and I will link to Patrick's LinkedIn profile. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you guys again soon.